Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Yud Ches Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today 2 lines off the bottom of the Shulchan Aruch on Kuf Yud Ches Amid Aleph, Siman Shin Yud Gimel Sif Beis. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanasunim Batzaru Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha, Hamakom Yerachem Alehem, V'yitziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelo La'iro Mishibud L'Gula, Hashta Bagolo V'zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Shalema from Shemer ben Esther Fradel, Yitzchak ben Sian ben Dusha, Rafal Yisrael Menachem ben Ita Gedentel, Chavadas Baserel. They should have Refu Shalema B'Sai Shachar Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus for Yonasan ben Michal and Yoel ben Michal. The Rebbeinu Shalom should watch over them together with all of our other brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. B'chol Makom Shehem. So here in Siman Shin Yud Gimel, we continue to discuss the question of closing windows, opening windows, door locks, things that we are putting onto a binyan, onto a structure, and the question of whether or not there's a boina shaila here. Do we look at it that you might be adding something onto a binyan, and therefore do we have to do something to mitigate the appearance and the feel of boina? So yesterday we discussed the case of the Nagor. Now the Nagor was a construction-like peg. So it was a peg of the same type that was typically used in construction. This we can see in the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan. Where is it? The Nagor. Oh, come on. In Ois Katan Yud Aleph. In Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Yud Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah says that the Nagor that we're talking about over here is a construction-like Nagor. It's the same kind of peg that they commonly used in construction. Now you want to take this peg, and you have a doorway. The door opens inwards. At the bottom of the doorway, there's a threshold, otherwise known as a saddle, that piece on the bottom of the door. And what you want to do is, you want to take this Nagor, and you're going to knock it into the threshold. What does that accomplish? Well, now you have a peg sticking up out of the threshold. Now nobody could open the door in. So nobody from outside could push the door in because it's going to come up against that Nagor. Problem over here is that, again, this Nagor is a construction-like implement. It looks very much like a typical construction peg, and you're knocking it in on the bottom into the threshold. Kind of looks like you're knocking it into the ground. This really doesn't pass the smell test. It looks and smells and tastes like an act of construction. Therefore, we have to do something to mitigate the shaila of boina. What do we have to do? The Mechaber told us that the peg, the Nagor, has to be tied to the doorway. How does tying it to the doorway help? Well, if this peg is an implement that's tied to the doorway, then clearly this is something that's hanging in the doorway so that it could be put in, taken out, put in, taken out, and it's always there available for use. That's why it's tied to the doorway. If it was something that you were installing in the eskufa, if this was an act of boina, and really what you were doing is you're permanently installing a peg into the threshold here, then why would it be tied to the door? You would just bang it in and zahu, that would be the end of it. So the fact that it's tied to the doorway, that shows us that this is not a tosefes al habinyan. This is not an addition to the structure. This is an implement. It's a mechanism, a locking mechanism, that's meant to be put in, taken out, put in, taken out. And if so, whenever you put it in, it's only a tosefes arai. Tosefes arai, we paskin like the Chachamim, and tosefes arai is mutter. That's what we learned by the Nagor. Then we learned, the complication that we learned yesterday was, as far as how the Nagor has to be tied to the doorway, that's going to depend on the specific Nagor. If this Nagor happens to be of the type that it has kind of like a knob on the end, and therefore it's very similar to the pestle of a mortar and pestle. Well, in that case, this nagar is kind of a self-standing keli. It looks like a pestle. If it's a self-standing keli, that fact alone is a mitigating factor in any shaila of Tesefes ala binyan. Why? Because if it's a self-standing keli, nobody takes a keli and permanently attaches it to a binyan. So if it's a self-standing keli, then we don't, suddenly the shaila of Tesefes ala binyan goes away just from the fact that it's a self-standing keli. Now, the fact that it's similar to a pestle is not enough to remove any need for modification. You still need to tie the nagar to the doorway. But what it does do is it changes how firmly you need to tie it to the doorway. If it has a glustera, that was the words of the Mechaber, if it has a knob on the end, so it's like the pestle, then if you tie it to the doorway, even if you tie it with a flimsy thread, even if you don't tie it to the door itself, you tie it to the briach. What's the briach? The briach is a bar. I think this briach that we're referring to over here is also a locking implement. It's talking about a bar that could be inserted into the doorway to, again, block the door from opening and closing and be removed. But maybe you're tying this nagar to the bar. You didn't tie it to the door. So if the nagar has that knob at the end, it could be a flimsy thread. It doesn't have to be tied to the door itself. It could be tied to the briach. It could be a long thread so that it's dragging on the floor. And all of that is enough. Why? Because you've got a string that's attaching to the doorway, which shows that it's hanging here to be inserted and taken out, inserted and taken out. And it looks like a self-standing keli, and we don't attach a keli permanently to a binyan. So this is enough to mitigate any shaila of boina. If, on the other hand, the nagar that we're talking about does not have a knob on the end, so it doesn't look like its own self-standing keli, it's not similar to a pestle, instead it's just a regular construction-grade peg, in that case, we need more of an attachment. And then the Mechaber said it depends. If you attach it to the doorway itself, it's still okay to have a flimsy thread. If you're going to attach it to the briach and not to the door itself, then it has to be a strong rope. That's a synopsis of what we learned yesterday when it comes to the nagar. Continuing on that theme, 2 lines off the bottom of Sif Beis, the Mechaber says, Kol nagar sha'amarnu. When we're talking about this nagar, now the Mechaber says, Kol nagar sha'amarnu. Every nagar. I'm not sure, by the way, I keep pronouncing it nagar. It might be more grammatically correct to pronounce it neger. I'm not 100% sure. Somehow my girsa de Yankasa is nagar. That's the way I always said it, but I don't know that I'm right. Kol nagar, I'm going to keep on saying it because otherwise I'm going to keep switching back with the neger and nagar, and I'm just going to confuse everybody. Kol nagar sha'amarnu. What's kol? All of these nagars that we're talking about. So let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in chaf. Kol nagar. Hainu afilu im yesh b'roisha glustera. Even the nagar that looks like the pestle because it has a knob at the end, vihu kashur, and even if it's properly tied to the doorway, so now this is a nagar that you're allowed to put in on Shabbos. It's like a pestle, it's tied to the doorway, so gesund hey, you're allowed to use it. V'ayin b'bir halacha. Now let's go back to the Mechaber. Kol nagar sha'amarnu. The nagar that we're talking about over here that you're allowed to put in and use on Shabbos, Mairi sha'askufa gavoya. We're talking about a case where the threshold, the saddle at the bottom of the doorway that you're inserting the nagar into, gavoya. It's high. So it's a thick nagar. Imagine again, this threshold is a flat piece of wood that lies at the bottom of the doorway, like the saddle that we often have at the bottom of a doorway. Says the Mechaber, in order for it to be mutter to use this nagar, so you've got a nagar that's been properly modified for Shabbos use. It's tied to the doorway. Maybe it's the nagar with the knob on the end that it's tied to the doorway. Whatever it is, it's a nagar that, according to Sif Beis, you're allowed to insert at the bottom into the threshold. But it has to be that threshold piece at the bottom of the doorway is thick. So imagine like when you come to the door, you have to step up onto the threshold because it's a thick threshold. Why does that matter? Says the Mechaber, Ma'isha Askufa Gavoya, it has to be a thick, high threshold, and therefore, when you take this nagar and you bang it into the threshold, it's going to go into the threshold piece, but it is not going to penetrate through the threshold and then into the ground. Aval, however, im nifchasa ha'askufa, but let's say this threshold piece has worn down. Everybody steps on it constantly. So it's no longer thick. It's gotten worn down. So that now, when you take the nagar, the peg, and you put it into the hole in the threshold, noikev tachtav ba'aretz, now it's going to penetrate into the ground. Heavy binyan va'asa linobai. The Mechaber is saying, this whole idea that we could be matir, putting the nagar into the askufa, into the threshold at the bottom of the doorway, that's only if we've got a nice thick threshold, so that when you put it in, it's only going into the threshold. But if that threshold is worn down, so that now when you put the nagar in, it goes through the threshold and then penetrates the ground, then you can't use it. Have a binyan, now it's mamish an act of binyan, va'asa linobai, and now you're not allowed to use it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, turning back to Kuf Yud Ches Amid Aleph, Mishnah Berurah is cutting Chaf Aleph, Aval Im. So, the Mechaber said, if the nagar is going to penetrate into the ground, you're not allowed to use it. But the Mishnah Berurah gives a caveat here. Vim asaloi beis yad, but let's say you take the nagar and you modify the nagar. You do something to the nagar in order to turn it into a keli. For example, vim asaloi beis yad, what if you fashion a handle for this nagar? And in brackets, the Mishnah Berurah says, what do I mean that you fashion a handle? It's like what we spoke about before, the peg that has a broad knob at the top. That also could be seen as a handle, right? A straight peg doesn't have a handle. You just wrap your hand around it. But if it has a knob, let's say at the top, so that your hand fits in under the knob, then when you wrap your hand around the middle of the peg, you could support the peg with your hand going up against the knob at the top. So that kind of forms a handle. So says the Mishnah Berurah, "Asalei beis yad, who kamay gluster de leel, v'doimel lamakeves shekoitche by besamim." So now again it becomes sort of like a pestle. Ach leel I read the hagluster ahaya by memela v'kan I read the asay say biyadai. A little complicated. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying is like this. In Sif Beis, we spoke about two different types of nagars. We spoke about a nagar that has a glustera, a nagar that has a knob at the end, and we said that by that nagar, you still have to tie it to the doorway, but it could be a flimsy string, it doesn't have to be tied to the door, it could be tied to the briach, etc., etc. Why? Because it's similar to a keli. Over here now in Sif Gimel, says the Mishnah Berurah, the Mechaber said that this idea that you're allowed to use the nagar is only if it doesn't penetrate the ground. Says the Mishnah Berurah, but wait a second. If you take the nagar and you actually do something to the nagar, you do a maisa, and you turn it into a nagar that has a handle. So you make it similar to the nagar of Sif Beis. But in Sif Beis, you didn't do a maisa. In Sif Beis, there are two different types of nagars. You had a nagar that's like a pestle. You didn't do a maisa to modify it. Over here, the Mishnah Berurah says, how about if you took the nagar and you actually modified it? You took a chisel and a hammer or whatever it is, and you shaped it so that now it has a handle. Muchach de klihu, now you've turned it biyadayim into a keli. V'suloi mechzi kibayna. And now there's no shiloh of binyan. Why? Because like we've said many times already, nobody takes a keli and installs it into a binyan on a permanent basis. So there's no shiloh baina. If you took the nagar and you actually did a maisa to modify it to turn it into a keli by fashioning a handle, shari va'afilu eina kosher. Now it doesn't have to be tied. Now it could go into the ground. Why? Because you turned it into a keli. Kain kasav Beis Yosef, so says the Beis Yosef, v'hevi rayim in arif. Okay, so again, I just want to be clear what we're saying over here. In Sif Beis, we spoke about a nagar that had a mitigating factor. We spoke about a nagar that's like a pestle. And we said since it's like a pestle, it looks like a self-standing keli, that mitigates the shaila of boineh, but you still need to tie it to the doorway. You don't get exempt from that. You still need to tie it to the doorway. But how you tie it could be very flimsy. It could be a weak thread, it could be a long thread, it could be tied to the briach, not even to the door, because the fact that it looks like a pestle is a mitigating factor. But in Sif Beis, you didn't make it look like a pestle. That's the type of nagar that you had. Now, here in Sif Beis, I'm sorry, everything that I just said Sif Beis was Sif Aleph. Now, here in Sif Beis, the Mechaber tells me a new halacha. The Mechaber says, if the nagar is going to penetrate the ground, big problem. That's boineh. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, how about if you took the nagar and you did a maisa biyodayim to go turn it into a keli? What'd you do? You made a handle. Or you took a hammer and a chisel and you fashioned it into something that looks like a pestle. Now you did a maisa biyodayim? You mamish turned it into a keli. If you mamish turned it into a keli, there can't be a shiloh of boineh anymore. Now it doesn't have to be tied to the door. Now it could even penetrate the ground. That's what the Mishnah Berurah is saying over here from the Beis Yosef. Continues the Mishnah Berurah and he says, "V'agra kasav b'biyurai," but the Gra says, "The ladas Rashi v'HaTorah loy motzinu heter b'nikmaz." We have no heter in the case of nikmaz. What's the case of nikmaz? Dahainu nifchasa ha'askufa afilu al yedei asiyas beis yad. The Gra disagrees with what the Mishnah Berurah just said. The Gra says that in the case of Sif Beis, where the askufa wore out and now the peg is going to penetrate the ground, that's usher even if you fashion it into a keli that has a handle. So the Mishnah Berurah is giving us two halachas over here. The Mishnah Berurah is saying, first of all, you should know, if you do a maisa to fashion it into a keli, then the halach of Sif Aleph changes. Now it doesn't even need to be tied to the doorway. If it happened to be like a pestle, it still needs to be tied to the doorway. But if you fashioned it into a keli by making it similar to a pestle, then it doesn't have to be tied to the doorway. Also says the Mishnah Berurah first, that if you did a maisa to make it look like a pestle, then, again, you fashioned it biyadayim into a keli, now it can even penetrate the ground. But he brings down from the Gra that according to the Torah and according to Rashi, you still can't allow it to penetrate the ground. Even if you turned it into a keli, you still cannot have it penetrate the ground. If the askuf is worn out, you still can't use it. Okay. Going weiter, Mishnah Berurah is Katan Chav Beis, Nifchasa ha'askufa. Now, another interesting halacha. There's a lot of complexities over here. Another interesting halacha. We know that very often, when you have the type of implements that we're discussing over here with these locks, I want you to imagine. Let's say you had a situation where you were using a locking device of the type that we're speaking about over here, of a nagar that goes into the threshold. If we had such a mitzias nowadays, and you went to Home Depot to buy this, how do you think this would work? Well, I imagine the way it would work is you would take something like a 1/4-inch drill bit, you would bore a very nice smooth hole into the askufa, into the threshold. Then there probably would be some kind of a metal sleeve that you would insert into the hole. And then you would have the nagar that goes into this beautifully prepared hole. Not only is it a beautifully prepared hole, but it's got a sleeve in it so it doesn't wear out, right? So too, let's say we're talking about the case that we had in the previous year, where you have a bar that goes into the wall. If one was doing this on a permanent basis, one would bore a nice, smooth, round hole in the wall, and probably put in a sleeve or something to protect it so that it doesn't get worn out. And now you would have a beautiful situation where you take your bar and you put it in and you take it out. Now, when you start to imagine it that way, in your mind, you could see right away how this would mitigate any shaila of boina. If that's the situation that you have, and now you're taking the nagar and you're putting it down into the threshold, into this beautifully prepared hole, does that look like Tosefes al Habinyan? Does that look like you're permanently installing something? No. Obviously, this is a mechanism that's been prepared for going in and going out. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says over here in Ois Katan Chaf Beis. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'im mitchila asa chalal bakarka, mokim shehanagar yeh roshei sham. The Mechaber just told us a halacha, that if the threshold is worn out, so that the nagar is going to go through the threshold into the ground, oh, that's binyan. That you can't do. I don't care if it's tied to the doorway. I don't care anything. That you can't do. That's binyan. Says the Mishnah Berurah. But if you prepared that hole, if you bored a beautiful, nice, round, smooth hole, in mitchila asa chalal bakarka, you made a hole in the ground for this purpose. Makom shehanagar yeh roshei sham, where the nagar is going to go in. Ve'enoi moisiv nekev ba'aretz. And now when you put the nagar in, are you making a new hole in the ground? No. And you're not adding anything. You're not making the hole bigger. You're putting it into the pre-assembled, the pre-created hole. Ain't isser. Then there's no isser here. Because this can't be considered Tosefes al Habinyan. And says the Mishnah Berurah an interesting thing. Ubazeh nicha, and once you understand this, it makes sense. Masha b'roiv habatim, this that in most houses nowadays, at least in the Chofetz Chaim's times, oisim nikavim b'choyma eitzel adelas mikan umikan. They make a hole in the doorposts, one hole on each side, v'toichvin habriach l'sham, and they take a bar, and they insert the bar into the hole on each end, shaholich mikatzezeh lazeh, so that you have a bar going all the way across from one doorpost to the other doorpost. So they bore a hole in each side. Obviously, they make the hole big enough so that you could take the bar, slide it all the way into one hole, put it into the doorway, and then slide it into the other hole. So now you have a bar barring the door from end to end. Everybody does this on Shabbos, and nobody suggests that it's usher because maybe it's Tosefes al Habinyan. The Mali shenichtas b'chayma lamata ba'aretz, says the Chofetz Chaim l'chayra, based on what we're learning here in Siv Beis, that you're not allowed to take the nagar and put it through the threshold into the ground because that's binyan. I would think that this is also binyan. What's the difference if you're sticking it into the ground or you're sticking it into the doorpost? If this is binyan, then l'chayra that should be binyan. So how does everybody do this? Ela mishum shenase mitchila lekach nekava b'chayma al kain ein iser. The answer must be because the holes were prepared for this in advance, and therefore there's no shaila of Tosefes al Habinyan. You're putting it into a pre-constructed hole. Once you're putting it into a pre-constructed hole that is clearly part of a locking mechanism, there's no shaila of Tosefes al Habinyan. Now, what's interesting about this, and I'm wondering if any of you listening have this kasha. No? Anyone? Anyone raising their hand? I'm wondering if anybody has the kasha. What did the Mishnah Berurah just say? The Mishnah Berurah just said that he's puzzled in a way. Everybody uses this locking mechanism of the bar that goes into both sides of the doorpost, and there doesn't seem to be a shaila of Tosefes al Habinyan. Answer must be because the holes were prepared in advance, and since we're using holes that are prepared in advance, that's not Tosefes al Habinyan. L'chayra, we discussed this case yesterday. We discussed yesterday, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, I think it was yesterday, in Sif Aleph, the koneh sheheskinu liyos noyel boy. That was the bar that was inserted into the doorpost. And over there we said that that bar that was inserted into the doorpost needs a machshava. You have to at least have a machshava on Erev Shabbos that I'm going to use this as a lock. So what's the Mishnah? Like the Mishnah Berurah seems to be saying over here that this bar that they used that went from side to side, he's like wondering, how could you use such a thing? Isn't that the halacha of Siv Beis that we just learned now in the beginning of today's shir? That if it goes through the threshold and into the ground, it's mamish boineh? So why isn't this bar that goes into the doorpost on one side and into the doorpost on the other side, why isn't that the same halacha? That should also be boineh. Elamai, the answer is because it's a pre-drilled hole. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says today. But I don't understand. Isn't that the halacha of yesterday? The koneh she'eskinu liyos noil boy? And the koneh she'eskinu liyos noil boy, we said that the reason it's not boineh is because you have a machshava on Erev Shabbos, that you're going to use it for a lock. So why is the Mishnah Berurah equating this case of the bar that goes into both sides of the doorway? Why is he equating it to this halacha of Sif Beis, of the nagar that goes through the threshold into the ground? Why doesn't he equate it to the halacha of yesterday, of kanesh eskinu liyos nagelbay, which is much more kuladik? And I think the answer is because the kanesh eskinu liyos nagelbay only went into one side of the doorway. It went into one hole on one side, and on the other side, it wasn't affixed to anything. It was just protruding. That does not appear to be as much of a shaila of boineh as the briach that goes across the entire doorway and is fixed in place on both sides. It seems that to the Chavetz Chaim, that felt much more like boineh, and therefore he's puzzled, how are you allowed to do it? The answer must be because of the pre-drilled holes. V'oid nira, and also it seems to me, says the Mishnah Berurah, also, there's another mitigating factor by that briach, by that bar that went across the whole doorway, and that is that they would make an iron ring in middle of that bar. That handle, that iron ring, was how you opened up the bar. That's how you removed the bar and how you inserted the bar. You slid it back and forth, and you took it out and you put it in using that iron ring. Oh, yad. So you made a handle. You turned it into a keli. We said already, if you make a handle, then you don't even need it to be tied to the doorway, because by making a handle, you turned it into a self-standing keli. Once it's a self-standing keli, there can't be a shaila of boineh. Brings us down from Taz Shariach Reinim. V'nira da'afilu l'das hagrosha makmel le'el ba'asal le'beis yad l'das Rashi v'HaTorah yesh l'hakol b'zem netzirav tamarishin shalataz. Says the Mishnah Berurah, even according to the Gra, who said in the name of Rashi and the Torah, that if you turn the nagar into a keli, you're still not allowed to have it go into the ground. Over here, where you take the briach and you turn the briach into a keli by making a handle, he says, even l'chayra, the gra would be maskim that this is okay. Mipnei tziruf tam harishain shel hataz, because I'm not sure. I don't remember what the tam harishain of the taz was. We'll try to come back to that. But in the meantime, we need to go weiter. Okay. Now we could turn to Sif Gimel, end of the top line, Kuf Yud Ches Amud Beis. So Sif Gimel needs a little bit of a hakdama. First of all, one thing that we have to understand is the way the houses were built and used back in the day. We've said this many times. The front yard was sort of an extension of the house. They used to cook in the front yard. They used to do laundry in the front yard. The backyard, another name for the backyard, was the muktzah. That was like a storage area. It wasn't, the kids didn't go out to play in the backyard. They didn't make barbecues in the backyard. The backyard was a storage facility. It was very often the dump. It was also the place where the outhouse maybe was, even though that wouldn't fit with what we're saying here. So scratch that. It was a storage area. It wasn't a heavily used area. So apparently, sometimes they would have a doorway going out from the house into the backyard that really wasn't used. It was used very, very infrequently. Maybe they also had a way to go out to the backyard from around the house. I don't know. But apparently it was somewhat common that they had a doorway going from the house to the backyard that was only used very infrequently. So much so that it didn't have a regular door. It didn't have a regular door on hinges that was made to be swung open and closed. Instead, it had some kind of a primitive trap door, which was something that closed up the opening, and it really remained in place for the vast majority of the time. And then every now and then, you would need to open up this opening to go out to the backyard. So then you would take this door piece and you would remove it to go out to the backyard. Now this is going to present a much bigger Tosefes al Habinyan Shaila. If you have a door that opens and closes, a door that you use all the time, it's much easier to mitigate any Shaila of Tosefes al Habinyan. Clearly, this is something that's made to open and close, put in, take out, put in, take out. But if it's something that's closed the vast majority of the time, and it's only once in a while that you take this door piece and remove it from the opening to go out, then when you put it back in, and you're putting it back in and it's going to remain there for a long time, that presents a much greater Tosefes al Habinyan Shaila, and therefore it's going to take more to mitigate the Shaila of Boina. Take a look here at the Mechaber. It says the Mechaber, last word, top line, Kuf Yud Chesam and Beis. Rechava she'acharei abotim, the storage area behind the house. She'ein nichnasim v'yotzim ba tadir, that people did not go into the house and out from the house to the Rechava on a frequent basis. And the Mefarshim say that it was used less than once every 30 days. Okay. Imasa delas lepischa. If you construct some kind of a door to close up the opening, oy shetoila ba machatzeles shalkanim, or maybe you want to hang like a heavy curtain, a mat. A machatzeles is a mat made out of reeds. You want to hang it in that opening. V'chein, or similarly, pirza, a breach in a fence, a breach in a wall or a fence around the yard. Shegidara b'koitzim ke'ein delis. And what you did was, you took bundles of koitzim, literally means thorns. I suppose it means like branches and twigs. You wove them into, or you tied them into bundles, and then you wove the bundles into something that you could use as a doorway. Ke'ein delis. So you have this opening, and you really want to close this opening up. And when the opening is closed, it's going to remain closed for a long time. You only open it once in a blue moon. So now, when you put this construct, the door or the mat or the bundles of thorns, when you put it into the opening, you're putting it there and it's going to stay there for a long time. So how do you mitigate the Shaila of Tosefes al Habinyan? Says the Mechaber, it depends. Im yesh lahem tzir. If this doorway has a pivot, what's a pivot? Explains the Ramah, Pirish Tzir, what is a pivot? Noikvin hadeles. Here, this is my board, okay? This is the board that you're going to use for the door. Noikvim hadeles. You make a hole where, in the bottom edge, or the top edge, probably the bottom edge, you drill a hole going up into the thickness of the doorway. V'koivim by eitz chad, and you stick in a sharp piece of wood. Kidei lachnisoi ba'aretz, right? So now you have over here, you have your pivot. I'll show you your pivot. Okay, let's do it this way. Here's your pivot. You made a hole up into the board, and you stuck in a piece of wood that's sharp. It's sharp on the top, so it could penetrate up into the luach. And it's also maybe sharp on the bottom, so it could stick into the ground. And now you could use it to pivot the door. Pirish tzer, noikvin adelis, you make a hole in the bottom of the door. V'koivim by eitz chad, and you put in a pointy dowel. Kedei lachnisei ba'aretz, so that the other side you could stick it into the ground. Lachzor lekan lekan, and now the door could swing on the pivot. That's what its tzir is. So says the Mechaber, if this door structure has a pivot, or afilu ein lehem atotzir, maybe it no longer has the pivot. Maybe the pivot fell out. Ela shahoyo lehem tzir. But somebody who looks at the door can tell that once upon a time it had a pivot. Maybe what happened is you stuck the pivot into the bottom of the door and it broke, but you could see a tiny little piece protruding. Or maybe the hole is nicker. The hole is recognizable where the tzir was. Even if it doesn't have a pivot now. But at one point in time it had a tzir, and it's nicker that at one point in time it had a pivot. Then noyalim bahem. Then you're allowed to put this door into the opening. Afilu heim nigrorim ba'aretz. Even if this door construct is dragging on the ground, we'll explain in a moment. Rak, with the caveat, shekisharam, this door construct has to be tied to the house. Utalaam, and it has to have been hung over there before Shabbos, linol behem, to use it as a door closure. V'loy chashiv kiboina, and in this case we don't consider this teisefes ala binyan, shenikar behem shehu deles, because now it's recognizable that this is not a teisefes ala binyan. This is not a permanently constructed addition to the house. You're not closing up the opening with a permanent addition to the house. Kevin shahoya lehem tzir, because it had a pivot. If it has a pivot, it's a door. If it has a door, it's not a permanent addition. It's only a teisefes arai. That's the whole point over here. So again, let's just give a synopsis of what the Mechaber just said. You have this opening. This opening, when you close it, stays closed for a long period of time. It's not a doorway that's commonly opened and closed. So now, when you go ahead and close it, there's a real bona fide shaila of teisefes ala binyan. It really looks like you're taking a piece of wood and you're making an addition to the house, or you're taking a reed and you're making an addition to the house and you're installing it on the house. No one's going to see you going in and out tomorrow or the next day. No, it's going to stay closed like that, maybe for a whole month. So there's a bona fide shaila over here. It really looks and feels and smells and tastes like teisefes ala binyan. How do we mitigate this teisefes ala binyan? Says the Mechaber, well, first of all, if the doorway had a pivot, well, when you have a board with a pivot, it's a door. Oh, it has the trappings of a door. That pivot is the trappings of a door. If it has the trappings of a door, or even if the pivot came out, but you could tell that it had a pivot once upon a time, so again it has the trappings of a door. Says the Mechaber, if it has the trappings of the door, then you could stand it up and you could put it into its place and you could close the opening with the following caveat. It has to be tied to the house. Now, what does tying it to the house do? The same thing that tying the nagar to the doorway did. Tying it to the house shows that this is a doorway implement. Why is it tied to the house? It's tied to the house so that when I take it out, it's going to hang over here and be ready to be put back in. So tying it to the house is another way of mitigating the teisefes ala binyan shaila, because now it doesn't look like you're making a permanent addition to the house. No, it's a door implement that's made to be put on, taken off, put on, taken off, and always be hanging over here at the ready to be used. So if it has a pivot, you could put it in as long as it's tied to the house. And even if it no longer has the pivot, but as long as you could tell that once upon a time it had a pivot. And the Mechaber added another thing. This is okay, afilu heim nigrarim ba'aretz, even if the door drags on the ground. What does that mean? Tell you what that means. That means that this is okay, even if the rope that you're using to tie it to the house is excessively long, so that when it's not in the doorway, the door piece drags or lays on the ground. Why is that a problem? Because again, if it would be hanging, so then it feels much more like it's hanging here at the ready to be put in, taken out, put in, taken out. But if it's got a rope that attaches it to the house, but it's laying on the ground, or even if it's got a rope that attaches it to the house, but it's, leaning on the ground and dragging on the ground, then it's not as nicker that this is a door piece that's hanging here to be at the ready to open, and close. But says the Mechaber, since it has the trappings of the door, because of the pivot, even that is okay. I want to continue with the Ramah before we see the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Ramah Haga, v'chol shkenim yesh lahem tzir adayin. Certainly if the pivot is still there. Ubelvad, but there's one thing you have to remember, says the Ramah. Shalo yachzir hatzir libekaimai kederch sheyispar lekabon simitov kuf yutes. If we're talking about a door that actually has a pivot, yes, you're allowed to take it, and you're allowed to stand it up in the opening and close the doorway. But you know what you can't do? You can't take the pivot and insert it. If there's a socket that the pivot is supposed to sit in, you're not allowed to take the pivot and insert it into the socket and stand it up. That would be a different shaila. That would be a baina shaila. So you could take the door piece and stand it up and close up the doorway, but you cannot insert the pivot into its socket. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Ais Kanachaf Gimel Tadir. So you have this doorway that's not used frequently. What the Macabre wants to say is, this door is only meant to be opened and closed very infrequently. Because people don't frequently go in and out over here. This is not the front door of the house that you go in and out. This is a door going to the rechava in the back. And therefore there's a very strong baina shaila when you take this door piece and close it. Unless you follow the guidelines laid out here by the Mechaber, those requirements make it clear that this is not a Tisefes Alabinyan, that this is a door meant to be open and closed. One of the cases that the Mechaber delineated was that you're closing up this opening with something fashioned out of thorns. What does that mean? It means that you took bundles of these twigs, I guess, that have thorns on them, and you fashioned bundles of them into a door. Sometimes you opened it, now you want to close it. If we're talking about a doorway that has a pivot, what the Mishnah Berurah is going back on is the Mechaber said a doorway that has a pivot, or a doorway that at one point in time had a pivot, even though it doesn't have a pivot now. Explains the Mishnah Berurah that means the pivot is not there now, but by looking at it, you could tell that at one point it had a pivot. Point being that this piece has the trappings of a door. In that case, the Mechaber said you could use this door piece to close up the opening. However, the door piece has to have been hung onto the house, and it has to be hanging on the house. What the Mechaber wants to say is, says the Mishnah Berurah, you tied it and you hung it there before Shabbos, with the intent to use it as a door closure. That's why it's now mutter to close it on Shabbos. Because now, even when it's because even if the fact is that while it's open, this door piece is going to drag on the ground, and when you close it, you have to lift it up, and you have to stand it up on the threshold to put it in place. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, even though when it's opened, it's going to drag on the ground, the rope is long, so it's going to lay partially on the ground, and therefore it's not as obviously a door meant for installation and removal and installation and removal. Nevertheless, since Lamaisa, it is tied and connected to the house from before Shabbos, and it also has the pivot which gives it the trappings of a door. Now it doesn't look like Tosefes Alabinyan. It looks like a door. It's got the trappings of a door. And Lamaisa, even if it's a long rope, it's still attached to the house with a rope. So it's hanging there ready to be used. You could tell that it's meant to be put on, taken off, put on, taken off. Weiter. Says the Mechaber. Aval im ein lohem tzir. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 lines off the top middle of the line. Aval im ein lohem tzir. But what if this door piece does not have the trappings of a door? It doesn't have a pivot. V'loy hoya lohem tzir. And it's not nickered that it ever had a tzir. Ein noyelim behem. Then you can't close the opening with this door piece. Ela im kain hayu givayhim min haaretz. Unless it's tied to the house in such a way that it does not touch the ground. It's tied to the house so that when it's hanging, it's elevated off the ground. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say, even if it's elevated off the ground by a hair, as long as it's not dragging on the ground, as long as it's not touching the ground, then even if it doesn't have the trappings of a door, you're still allowed to use it on Shabbos. Why? Because the fact that it's connected to the house and it's hanging at the ready to be put in, it's no longer Betsy Kabinyan. That mitigates the Boina Shaila, because now it doesn't look like Teisefes Alabinyan. The fact that it's hanging there shows that it's there to be opened, closed, opened, closed. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Eis Kadach Chav Zayin, Gevayim in the Aretz, Tzad Aloymar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, Shayu Kishurais Utaluyais Miba'ayim, that the door was tied to the house and hanging from before Shabbos, be'inyan in such a manner that even when it's opened, it doesn't drag or touch the ground. Even if it's only elevated by the ground by a hair. And what's the rationale of this? What's the rationale that you have this board that has no trappings of a door, and you have a doorway that's very infrequently opened, and yet we don't have a Teisefes Alabinyan Shaila just because it's tied to the house and it's not touching the ground? What's the rationale for that? It no longer looks like Teisefes Alabinyan when you take it and you put it into the doorway, even if it doesn't have the trappings of a door. Because Lamaisa, even when the doorway is opened, hein mechubarin, the door piece is still attached to the house, ukevuin sham heitiv, and it's firmly attached to the house, she'ein nigrares ba'aretz, it doesn't drag on the floor. If it would drag on the floor, it might look like a piece that has nothing to do with the house, and now you're taking it and you're being moisef alabinyan in order to close it. But the fact that it's hanging at the ready and not laying on the ground shows that this is an implement that belongs to the house, that's made to be hanging at the ready, put in, taken out, put in, taken out, and is no longer a Teisefes Alabinyan Shaila. Let's go a little bit further just to finish Sif Gimel. I thought we were going to finish Sif Dalet too, but hey, what do I know? Says the Mechaber, finally, when it comes to a door that is made to be opened and closed all the time, the front door of a house, people are constantly going in and out, you're allowed to close the door, even if it never had a pivot, and it drags on the ground, doesn't matter. There can't be a Teisefes Alabinyan Shaila. This door is being opened and closed, taken out and put in all the time. Since you use it all the time, everybody understands that this is a door. It doesn't look like Teisefes Alabinyan. This is true even if it drags on the ground. It lays on the ground or drags on the ground when you open it. From the language of the Mechaber, it is implied that it does sound like this door still has to be tied to the house. From the Ramah, it sounds like if this is a door that's being commonly used, even if it's not tied to the house at all, shari im yeshla skufa melamata, it's mutter, so long as the doorway has the trappings of a doorway that's going to have a door, which means that it has a threshold. V'yesh lahakal bazeh. He says he could be mekel, ein begrotchkat shkein dasarif, Rambam ubefrat shkein sasam harama. And we'll stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Dalet. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa, and Shidduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Goel Tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.